Hello and welcome. I'm Caitlin O'Neill Amaral of the English department here at Umass Dartmouth, and this is a Journalism Alliance event. It's a collaboration with the Public's Radio and Umass Dartmouth, and we're here to talk about the power of radio to sustain communities. And I'm going to introduce you to our panelists. The genesis of this panel was an email from Professor Richard Pelt-Steele last November telling me about one of his students at UMass Law, Ricardo Serrano. They're both sitting over there to my left, about his experience as a student broadcaster at the University of Puerto Rico during Hurricane Maria in 2017. And since this is a collaboration between a radio station and our university, it sounded like the perfect opportunity to talk about the power of radio broadcast. Joining them, I also have Professor Lisa Maya Nauer of the Sociology and Anthropology Department here at UMass Dartmouth, and she's going to talk about the impact of community radio in Guatemala in slightly different circumstances, but I think equally powerful. And finally, we have Sally Isley from the Public's Radio here in Rhode Island in southeastern Massachusetts to talk about the power of radio, maybe a little bit closer to home. So Ricardo and Richard are going to start us off, and we'll move through the panel and talk about all of these interesting ways that radio can impact our communities.
Great, thank you. So thanks everyone who's here. Thank you very much, Caitlin, for taking the initiative upon our communication in the fall. Caitlin did ask me briefly to say why. I also want to say thanks to all the law students who are here. I think this is the single greatest migration from Faunce Corner Road to campus that's ever occurred. But so that's awesome. The Caitlin asked me to say how this came to be just for a moment, and that is that I want to tell you that when I did college journalism radio, and it was at a time when you want to put an interview in a story, you needed magnetic tape and a razor blade and masking tape, and that's how you cut the interview literally into the story, and then you played the magnetic tape and hoped that the seal you made didn't break. Things have changed a little bit, from what I understand, and I learned a lot about how things have changed from Ricardo, who, among other things, will explain that radio now is so much more even than just broadcast. And so what I learned was fascinating, and then for it to come up in the context in which it did in his experience in Puerto Rico was really, really a special story that I thought our community would benefit from. So I appreciate his willingness when he's got all the stresses of so many of you, of being a 1L and everything else going on, to be willing to take the time to do that. So what we thought we'd do is I might just ask him some questions to share this story, much in the same way that he shared it with me. But by way of introduction of him, I want to start with this radio excerpt.
Pero, bienvenido a este su programa de política, cultura y sociedad, fatiga mental. Estamos aquí en el recinto universitario de Mayagüez, el estudio de radio colegial. Al lado mío se encuentra, ya no le puedo decir ni su primer nombre, el señor Serrano. ¿Todo bien, Ricky?
No.
Momento triste en la historia.
Sí,
Todo el mundo ya sabe de qué estamos hablando, todos nos sentimos igual. El parking a las 7:40 AM estaba vacío, nadie quería venir a la universidad.
esto es una tragedia.
Yeah, ready for the
Yo
best
esperaba
part.
más de mi país, siendo honesto.
Yo esperaba más de la democracia. Damn. Empezamos.
So what you need to know
Lo
is
primero fue que tú y yo nos
that's,
la vivimos y llegamos a las 6:40 AM.
in the voice, in the narrative, and in the music. That is the creator of Fatiga Mental, who is right here. So I want to start just by asking Ricardo to tell us about what is Fatiga Mental and what is Radio Colegial.
So, hi guys. Shout out to the law school. So Fatiga Mental is a podcast that we started in 2015, September. I was just entering the University of Puerto Rico at Mayagüez, and I entered being a computer engineering student, and I took my first humanistic course in law, and I changed my mind, and I changed to political science right away. And then I started talking with my partners from computer engineering, and we started a podcast called Fatiga Mental with different perspective of student life and the things we learn in the university. And then after a semester of programs, we decided to gather with Radio Colegial, which was the student-run radio platform of the university. This radio platform acted as a workshop for students in the university, so we could do different marketing, video, photography, podcasting, radio and internet broadcasting, and also live events in the university. And we took practice from that. So that's
Great. So in order to tell the story of the connection from Radio Colegial to Hurricane Maria, there's a really important piece that you have to get, which is the involvement of Ricardo and Radio Colegial with a student strike that occurred on the UPR campus and over the course of a couple of years, but then really coming to a head with students shutting the campus down not long before the hurricane. And that was a critical developmental time for Radio Colegial. So I want to ask Ricardo to talk about that, but also in the course of talking about that, to say something about what a student strike is, because we don't have that concept exactly here in the mainland. And if there are any RAs from main campus in the room, you might be interested in this.
So there are 11 campuses in the University of Puerto Rico in the system of the university around the island. For each campus in the system of the Puerto Rico's public university, a student council is organized. This council gathers yearly in an ordinary assembly. There can also be extraordinary assemblies called forth by that council. That council can call for a strike and a stop in the university academic experiences of that time and just take control of the grounds of the university. That happened in and around April 7th. In April 7th, student strike started in the University of Puerto Rico that lasted from April till May 30. In that strike, all of the 11 campuses of the island were stopped, and all of the 11 student councils of each of the campuses took control of the campus, and they had to create infrastructures for the students that were involved in the strike. Each of the campuses had a student-based radio station, and the journalism and reporting responsibilities of the period of that strike became to be our responsibility in the Mayagüez campus. So we became to do all the journalism and video events throughout the period of that strike.
And networked.
And we networked.
I understand that was critical, was the kind of interplay between the campuses, that you were in communication with each other for the first time through the coverage.
So each as I mentioned, each campus had its own student-based radio station. So every campus had the responsibility to do its own journalism and reporting. So we had to create a network between all the campuses and the student organizations, so we can make the studies run between campus to campus around the island, kind of against the mainstream media at the time.
And so I'm going to take some things you told me. Tell me if I get this right.
Yes.
It was, the strike is illegal, right?
Yes.
So it's against the law in theory for the students to do this.
Yes.
And you've shut the campus down. You're inside
Yes.
the campus. And so it's difficult for the students to get their message out because they're inside and they can't leave, because if they leave, the authorities will retake the campus.
So most of the campuses in Puerto Rico are gated communities. So when the strikes happen, the students take control of the gates and close them. We take control of the grounds of the school, and then obviously as the work stopped, the university stops electricity, water, and everything that goes inside the school. So the same student council has to take those responsibilities and provide for those students in the strike.
So you guys are on, you were using Mixer.
Mixler, yes.
Mixler at this time. And so how did you get electricity to?
So around each campus, there's a lot of student rental places, and the council managed to get electricity from those places where the students lived to the campus from the gates. Also, we managed to get water, even cooking places and stuff. So it was a really interesting machine that we built.
And say something about these numbers, if you would, the amount of traffic you were getting.
So we were getting, those are the numbers of the different assemblies, student assemblies that we were streaming live organically in each of the students' assemblies that the student body called forth. As you can see, the latest one is from April 6th. That's the day, just the day before that the University of Puerto Rico, only the Mayagüez campus, joined the indefinite system-wide strike of the 11 campuses of the university.
And these numbers, they caught the attention of WPRA, the local commercial radio station.
So at the time we looked at, we had like a collaboration with a local radio station that enabled us to bring our programs to the local AM waves of the west of Puerto Rico. And yes, when we started getting those numbers and then started doing Facebook Lives and other events, they started noticing the work that we were doing.
Because I guess we should clarify that UPR had planned to buy a transmitter for the campus, but never did.
Yes.
So you guys were stuck online unless and until you had this collaboration with the local.
Yes, the University of Puerto Rico was planning to get AM radio waves for the university and let us work part of those hours throughout the year, but they decided that that wasn't the way to go. Money. Yes.
So let me remind you what happens on September 20, 2017, right? Hurricane Maria tears right across the island, so you've got everything within its scope. And so these are some numbers that Ricky put together for us. Explain what happened, I guess, from your experience there.
So at the end of the strike, we ended the strike at May 30, 2017. Then we had summer. We had to take summer to get the makeup classes of the strike. Then in September of that same year, the Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico. And everything, the day after of the hurricane, everything, all electricity was gone, all telecommunications and cell phone signal was gone, all networking or social networks that were put in place at the time weren't working. So we had to make our own network. I was staying at the time in Ponce, Puerto Rico, and had to travel from Ponce to Mayagüez with, normally would take an hour. It took more than a day after that hurricane. I had to wait for gas like 12 hours to get like $20 of gas. That's sounds crazy, but it was like that at the time. And we had to create, with the infrastructure that we created for the strike and all the networking that was done, we managed to build a network for helping the communities of the West. When I got to Mayagüez and talked with Dr. Edwin Asensio, he is one of the leading minds of the campus in research and diverse community projects. We initiated Proyecto Esperanza on October 15, 2017. This project reached around 8 vulnerable communities in the municipality of Mayagüez. We impacted poverty and all the communities that were directly in need through the collection and delivery of supplies, household goods, medical goods, and other necessities. All this was done throughout the network and the infrastructure that was done beforehand for the student strike. We managed to get all this help.
And there was some relationship with the team that had been Radio Colegial had some relationship with WPRA at this time, and WPRA, as you explained, became something of a hub.
Analogously to us, only 12 radio stations remained on air during and after the storm. One of them was WPRA 990, who was the radio station that we have the collaboration with. And they managed to make themselves a hub and a distribution center for help and other necessities, because they could actually communicate with the people that were starting to get signal as the days go by, and were making their needs, expressing their needs throughout the radio signals, and people could actually distribute goods better, and we could actually supply them most and much of the goods that they needed throughout that period of time.
The slide just went by and said organizando, and if you say something, just because I think that's fascinating, the way you explained to me, it's not entirely clear to me how difficult it is to coordinate the supplies, talking about the insulin, the family supplies.
It's all the supplies came mostly from the north of the island, because there is where most of the resources are. We had to make a distribution center where we packed and distributed all the goods and make little bags for each family, but each family had specific needs. Pregnant women, children, sick old people, and people that need specific medical needs. Some old people that needed to clean their house or build their ceilings or stuff like that. So we need to work with each of the families on a case-by-case basis.
And even insulin had to be kept cold, which is not an easy task.
That's true.
So I just love this slide, because the first video that surfaces then online afterwards, all the way in January 2018, but you finally Radio Colegial back on the air as it were, air both in every sense.
Yes, we had a long time before we came back on air. All of the radio station that we had worked on was completely destroyed by the hurricane. We have to rebuild it back in, and then get all the connections.
Including this setup.
Yes, everything.
And then there's one final epilogue here before we give it over, and that's fascinating. And it goes to, in particular, the Facebook Live platform. So explain that real quick.
So all of this that I explained today was done between 2015 and 2018, and all was done organically. Basically on Facebook, what we did is not possible at this time because of the new algorithms that are working their way throughout the live pages on Facebook. Right now, the way that it works is that from the totality of the likes or followers of one page, we as creators only have access to a little bit of that audience at a time if we don't pay for advertisements. So when we pay for advertisements, actually, it opens the gates for the older rest of the audiences already following us and the new audience that is not. So that reach or organic reach that was possible for a page of 10,000 followers at the time to have multiple thousands of views is not possible anymore.
And so, I mean, my takeaway, I find that part fascinating, and the takeaway I have on a week where we're talking about public radio is that they were able to do what they could do in large measure through the available platforms, Mixler, Facebook Live. But when the corporate entities decided that paid is going to push down everything else, then you've really got to have your own platform, whether it be a transmitter or a web platform, and that in order to reach people in case of in case like this, in case of disaster, in case of strike coverage or whatever it is. And so that's kind of a dark note to end on. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
I think Lisa will be able to bring us back up, right?
Bring
So
things
I think
up.
she's going to tell a similar story of
I'll trade with you. There you are.
fortitude in the face of technological challenges.
Okay, so we are listening to what is going out over the air in Santa Eulalia, which is a primarily Canjobal town in northern Huehuetenango in Guatemala. Canjobal are one of the 22 Maya ethnicities in Guatemala, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of this radio station. And they also have a Facebook page. I'll just kind of flip this up here. So this is the call numbers, and you'll see llamadas desde los Estados Unidos. So this is a very important focal point between the Canjobal community, advertising an event in Oregon. We have some live streaming of the Gran Baile Social in Los Angeles, California. So the various points of the Canjobal or the Eulalense diaspora kind of get connected through the radio station and through Facebook. Can we turn this on even a little bit more? So I can just kind of keep the marimba in the background. We could dance a little bit to the marimba, very popular. But so the story that I'm going to tell very briefly about this radio station, I'm going to kind of backtrack a little bit and talk about community radio in Guatemala. So in northern Huehuetenango, there has been a series of conflicts over land, particularly over what are called megaproyectos, mega projects, things like mining, hydroelectric dams that are basically being sort of sponsored by foreign transnationals and supported and promoted by the Guatemalan government against the wishes of the local population, which is primarily an indigenous population. And so the community radio station, which was founded I think about 17 years ago, by people who were ex-combatants, ex-guerrilla combatants in the Civil War in Guatemala, which I'll again talk about briefly, has been one of the focal points of expressing the community's views. So what happened in January of 2015, and this was, I had been in Guatemala and I was on my way out of the country, going to the airport, and I sort of get these series of text messages about people having been beaten up, including people from the radio station. When some community leaders from a neighboring community have been involved in a dispute with the police, again, having to do with this proposed hydroelectric project. And so people from the community radio station, along with other people who were gathered around the court waiting to hear what was going to happen with these community leaders who had been arrested, got beaten up. The radio station had been kind of broadcasting about this. And so, one of the people who had been beaten up by the police on that day in January later died, actually on St. Patrick's Day. The radio station was closed down by the town mayor, who was believed to be behind these disturbances and the beating up of people, including the radio station staff. And so the radio station had space in the municipal building in Santa Eulalia. They had this space near, as part of the city hall. And the mayor just cut off the power to the radio station, said that they couldn't broadcast any longer, so they started to broadcast online using Facebook in people's homes. So they didn't occupy the headquarters of the radio station, but people had, internet, used their cell phones to get Wi-Fi and to broadcast in their homes, different places. So one would be at someone's home on one program, someone else's home on another program, and basically broadcasting via internet, via Facebook. The radio was supposed to go back on the air. They had agreed with a negotiation, and then again, a bunch of thugs tied to the mayor came and broke this up again. So there was a period of really about a year and a half where the radio station was in this tenuous relationship with the municipal authorities. And the reason that I mention this is that I think that this is a focal point of looking at the relationship between indigenous people and the state in Guatemala. So the role that community radio has played. Community radio in Guatemala is largely, but not exclusively, indigenous radio. So Guatemala, for those of you who are not that familiar, is a country that is majority indigenous, conquered by the Spanish, or not conquered, but occupied by the Spanish in 1524. And out of respect to my Mayan friends, I always have to start the story 500 years ago because it really is a kind of continuity. So a series of displacements, of disenfranchisements, of not counting indigenous people as full citizens of the country really kind of give us the background to why community radio becomes so important. So community radio really grows out of the indigenous movement, and most of the radio stations were formed during or after the armed internal conflict. So this was a civil war in Guatemala that took place from the 1960s-ish to 1996 when there were peace accords. During this, it was declared a genocide by the United Nations. Over 250,000 people were killed. 87% of those were indigenous, and started doing radio with literally nothing, like just stuff that they borrowed from people's home stereo systems. And this idea that anybody could do radio. These were not people who had training, they weren't professionals, they hadn't gone to college, some of them were not literate, they were agricultural workers, they were farmers, subsistence farmers, shoemakers, weavers, and they started radio stations all across the country. Some of them were ex-combatants, like the people who founded Sinucolom Conop in Santa Eulalia, and who said, okay, we fought this war, we didn't exactly win, but let's start a radio station and let's, bring the voice of the people. One of the contradictions, though, has been that the Guatemalan government never created a legal status for these radio stations. So they exist in a kind of limbo. They say, well, no, under the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People, Convention 169 of the International Labor Organization, that there are laws that protect, our freedom of expression, but the state doesn't give us licenses. So frequently there are raids on community radio stations. They go off the air, they get back on the air, and so and they take the equipment. One of the radio stations was founded by somebody who had run, just kind of connecting to your story a little bit, a guerrilla radio station during the armed conflict that was hidden in the slopes of one of the volcanoes. And they had this kind of clandestine, and they couldn't broadcast live because it was too dangerous. If they ever found the transmitter, they would kill the broadcaster. So they would record on cassettes, not even with razor blades to cut the cassette, but on cassette, and they would put the cassette on a little tape player, and then that would be transmitted. So that transmitter that they had after the war ended, they brought this transmitter down. They set up a youth-oriented community radio station in a little town outside Quetzaltenango. And then when that station was raided a couple of years ago, they took that it was this historic transmitter. So I think that this is, I guess, just a couple of points that I want to make, because I want to leave time for the rest of the panel, that the role that the radio stations play, I think, is really significant. So one is around the issue of indigenous language preservation. So many of these stations do broadcast in Tzotzil, Quiché, Quechua, Cancobal, different of the Maya languages. And so this is really important because there is a danger of languages being lost in many ways because parents encourage their children to learn Spanish, and which is the dominant language, and English, which is becoming increasingly important around the world. And so there are children who don't really speak their language completely because the parents think that the children, se va a adelantar más, they're going to get ahead more if they speak Spanish, and that speaking Quechua or speaking Cancobal is going to be a disadvantage. So the radio stations, I think, play a really important role. They also, the issue of gender has been a little, Guatemala, like many places in the world, including our own country, suffers from patriarchy, suffers from machismo. So many of the early broadcasters and the radio stations were founded by men. but there has been increasingly, roles played by women as broadcasters. There is an association throughout Central America. I think it's I don't remember the name now, but the Central American Association that brings together indigenous women broadcasters from throughout Latin America, and so there's really this kind of reinforcement of women from different communities, different countries, different cultures, of the experience of really bringing women's voices to the forefront. So I think that's been really important, and I've seen advances in that. And, in children, one of the things that I love about Snukolom Konop is that there's a Sunday morning program, and Sunday morning is market day. So in rural towns, that's when everybody comes to town from the rural surrounding hamlets out in the mountains, comes to town, goes to church, does their marketing, and so they bring their kids. And so the kids come into the radio station and do broadcasting, and they're 7 years old, 10 years old, 11 years old. It's just really wonderful to see the kids, grabbing the microphone and, saying what they need to say, interviewing each other. So that's another way of also kind of passing this idea of freedom of expression along. I think that, as I mentioned, reporting on local news. So in a lot of these rural communities, the national newspapers don't even distribute there. It's like they don't even bother sending the national newspaper that's published in the capital. It's 12 hours away by bus on really bad roads to get there, if you get all the connections correctly. So, the newspaper might come a day late, maybe 1 or 2 copies. And I think that radio also is incredibly important in areas where literacy is really low, so the importance of oral communication for places where there's a very low level of literacy, where people don't have televisions, don't have a lot of electricity. You can still listen on a transistor if the power goes. So radio, I think, globally is something that's really important in the developing world. It has this importance, I think, that we perhaps don't understand quite as much here. We don't listen to radio hours and hours and hours, but people in rural areas keep the radio on all day. It's what they do when they're at home, when women are washing clothes and grinding corn and doing all of that. The radio is kind of on as a backdrop. And the other point, I guess, is, and this radio station really exemplifies this, is, let's see my notes here, is the contact with the diaspora. And so in a couple of radio stations that I visited where there is a strong connection to the migrant community, there's one video clip here of a migrant who was on a bus that crashed in Chiapas. I don't think that reported here in the United States that much, but people leaving Guatemala and heading towards the United States, there was a bus crash in Mexico, in the state of Chiapas, not that far from the border. And the funeral of the migrant, one of the people on that bus that crashed was from Santa Eulalia, and so his funeral, was covered. So they also do a lot of coverage of local events and reporting on local news, things that are important to the community that might not make it into the mainstream news, which I think is very similar also to the case of student radio, where it's reporting on things that really have a direct and immediate impact on people in that community, as well as, so the contact with the diaspora, people will call the radio station, will say, could you please say, play such and such, they'll do requests. So such and such, marimba, el requiche by the grupo no sé qué, and so, putting in requests or sending, saludos a mi hermano, feliz cumpleaños, qué sé yo, so, birthday greetings, weddings, all of this kind of stuff that community radio is great at, or finding lost items. I was in a radio station in another town, and somebody had lost their DPI, their personal identification document. It got turned into the radio station. The radio station said, hey, we have this document, it belongs to so-and-so, and then the guy came half an hour later and picked it up at the radio station. So it really serves this incredible community purpose. Okay, I'm going to shut up.
Which I think is a good segue to our own community radio.
Yes, to our own community and radio in this area. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So my name's Sally Isley, and I'm the managing editor at the Public's Radio, which is the public radio station in Providence, Rhode Island. And I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about the role of public radio in American journalism. And I speak from a career that's gone back a few decades and started actually when I was your age in college. I went into radio as a kind of an accident. I was a journalism student, and back then you could either be a print student or you could go into communications, and I didn't want to go into communications. I wanted to be a newspaper reporter, but I couldn't get an internship at the state news. I went to Michigan State University. So somebody said, why don't you check out the student radio stations? Well, we had 5 radio stations and a network back then, and it was all through the telephone lines, but it was the largest campus network in the country. And so I walked in the door of the Student Services building for what I thought was gonna be like a second-class internship, because I really wanted to work at the newspaper, and I fell in love with the medium that I'm still in. And so I'm one of these lucky ones that can say, you know, I'm as passionate today about the work that I do as I was when I walked in the door when I was 18 years old at the Student Services building. I've also seen a lot of change, and it's funny because how many times has the demise of radio been predicted? Since the invention of television, then, you know, there was the advent of satellite radio, and everybody thought terrestrial radio was history, and then the digital age and podcasting, and so now, you know, once again, there's conversation about the future of good old-fashioned terrestrial radio broadcast off of towers around the world. And yet, in the medium that I'm in, which is public radio, we've seen an audience growth in my career that's really stunning, going from, you know, a couple of million people around the country back in the 80s to, you know, almost 40 million people today. And I mean, it's been amazing, and I've seen the transformation. So this was largely led by NPR. Everybody knows about NPR, and you know, it launched these programs called Morning Edition and All Things Considered that just became popular. But back in the day when that happened, public radio was still this sort of quirky, left of the dial thing that basically anybody who could tap dance on a tabletop could get on the radio, and that's what it was all about, from one end of the country to the next. Well, the network came in and these programs started catching on. It was kind of, you know, remarkable. And then, but it was still this community-based service that was mission-driven. That in some parts of our country, you know, Alaska comes to mind, still to this day, where community radio and public broadcasting is a vital, you know, form of communication upon which, you know, life and death sort of decisions and communication is made. But I've seen, led by the network, the network, public radio became more popular, and it wasn't possible to tap dance your way onto the air anymore, but it was still a kind of quirky thing. And along the way, it began to sort of look at itself and really kind of wrestle with the question of, is public broadcasting about journalism? How much of this is really about journalism, and how much of this is about sort of art meets writing meets radio meets, you know, isn't this great? And that happened with the Persian Gulf War. It happened with Tiananmen Square. It's happened, you know, in our presidential elections. And the answer is public broadcasting is about journalism, and public broadcasting has become one of the most important and also, ironically, one of the most stable forms of journalism in this country. And it is ironic because we have this old-fashioned and very annoying habit of going on the air and asking people to call us and give us money. And that's how we have managed to survive, even as, you know, some of the biggest newspapers in the country have, you know, have cut back sadly and terribly, public broadcasting has become more valuable and more important. Now I'm still talking at the national level, but let me say that I've never worked for NPR except as a freelancer and with their editors, et cetera. I have always been about local radio, and the reason why that is because it is basically radio in its simplest and most important form, and because it's about the community service element, and it's about actually, looking at the faces around, not sort of being at 30,000 feet. Well, for a long time, the local stations were content to say, isn't this great? NPR is growing the audience, and so we're getting all this extra money, and wow, we don't have to do a thing. We're going to put these programs on the radio, but we don't actually have to be accountable and build our own, staffs and do local journalism. And I have seen that happily change in the last 15, 20 years, and it's still changing as stations realize that they actually have to, for their own survival, they really have to have their own identity and their own connections to the community, but also as, part of their mission as community service, publicly funded institutions, they need to do that. So that's what I've been about. I've been sort of involved in startups, and I helped build the newsroom in San Francisco at KQED, and then I did that again in Chicago at WBEZ with the guy who's now my boss, who's at the Public's Radio in Rhode Island, used to basically work in Chicago, and we worked together for a long time. Anyway, so I'm working out here in Providence and really loving the opportunity to be back in the business at a time when, journalism and the work that we do it's never been more important. And so a lot of what we're doing is looking for ways to try and fill some of the gaps that have been left by the decline of local newspapers. But we can't be that local newspaper. We have to pick and choose, and we have to, along the way, look for opportunities to form collaborations as well. And one of those opportunities that I wanted to talk about, maybe I'll look at the clock and say I might be able to play just a couple minutes of this, is so we have to say, okay, we're not going to be the newspaper because we're never going to have 100 reporters and be able to work that way. We have a staff of 6 and a couple of great interns who are in this audience, and we are going to do what we can, but we'll do it as well as we can do it. And so we pick and choose. And so we also, we're collaborating with ProPublica, which is a great publicly funded online news organization based in New York, that specializes in investigative reporting. And one of our reporters, Lynn Arditi, applied for and got a fellowship to work with them on a story that is basically looking at the training system for 911 operators in the state of Rhode Island. And we just did this story last week. Some of you may have heard it, but Rhode Island's 911 system has problems, and there are lots of reasons to think that because of training and lack of training and improper training, that people are actually dying because they are not getting the right instructions over the telephone from first responders, from the call takers at 911. So we did this story, and it's the first of what will be a series of stories in the way that we can cover local community and try to make a difference. And I'll just play a few minutes of it, and then I'm happy to answer questions or open it up for other discussions.
Yeah, we'll do questions
so
after
let's
the
see
video.
if I can pull this up here.
I think he has it on his screen over there.
I
Isn't
know,
this
but
plugged in?
I can run it if you like.
you want to, okay.
I think
We'll
you'll be able
just
to
run my
hear it
shot.
if he runs it.
Okay.
Because it's hooked up to the, maybe?
In a medical emergency, every minute matters. It can mean the difference between life or death. And that was the case this Friday morning in February of 2018.
Okay, is he on his back? He's throwing up right now.
6-month-old Elijah had gone down for his nap. About 20 minutes later, he was found unconscious. The baby's aunt, Jessica, is talking with 911.
My aunt is he on his back? Make sure he's not on his back. Make sure he's on his back. Not on his back. He's on his back, but he's turning purple. Not.
Turning purple is a sign the baby isn't breathing. But 18 seconds into the call, the woman at 911 is still trying to position the baby to prevent choking.
I would say that this particular call is in the top 15 worst calls I've ever heard in my life, maybe in the top 10.
That's Dr. Jeff Clausen, medical director of the International Academies of Emergency Dispatch in Salt Lake City, Utah. He's one of 3 experts that reviewed the call the family shared with the public's radio. Clausen says the call is a tragic example of what's wrong with the way Rhode Island is training its 911 call takers. For one thing, the call taker missed the most basic signs that the baby wasn't breathing.
If the baby was breathing this shallow thing, the baby is not breathing adequately. That was reinforced by fingers and things turning blue. And the baby was also, at times, clearly not breathing.
When a baby is not breathing or not breathing normally, that's critical, because every minute without oxygen increases the likelihood of brain damage and death. So a 911 call taker needs to figure out whether or not the baby is breathing normally in the first minute or so of the call. Dr. Peter Antevi is a pediatric emergency medicine physician and medical director for several EMS agencies in South Florida.
Not breathing normally and not conscious, that equals cardiac arrest, that equals the need for CPR.
Rhode Island public safety officials have defended the way their system is set up, pointing out that call takers are certified in Red Cross CPR and basic first aid. But other states do it differently. In every other New England state, as well as Pennsylvania and New Jersey, among others, 911 calls for cardiac arrest and other medical emergencies are handled by certified emergency medical dispatchers, or EMDs. They're trained to follow carefully scripted instructions to guide someone over the phone to perform CPR. One medical dispatch expert compared these instructions to a pilot's pre-flight checklist. Seattle developed emergency dispatch training decades ago with explicit focus on telephone CPR.
And they saw very quickly that they were literally snatching lives from the jaws of death among patients who had cardiac arrest in their homes and in the community.
Dr. Mickey Eisenberg is medical director of King County Emergency Medical Services in Seattle, Washington. He says there's a huge opportunity for improving survival rates in places like Rhode Island through better CPR training.
If every community had sort of a clone of the Seattle King County program, including bystander CPR and telephone CPR, you're talking about tens of thousands of additional lives saved.
Currently, about 1 in 10 people who experience.
So what that is an example of is journalism in which we're trying to make a difference. And already through the reporting that Lynn has done, it was discovered by the state police that the guy who was training the operators had credentials that expired 3 years ago, and he's been removed. So that happened even before the story came out, and that was, as a result, that was an example of impact. That's the kind of thing, that is the kind of thing that that radio can do, that public radio can do in a community today. And I'll stop there in case anyone has questions.
So we thought we'd open up the last 10 minutes here to any questions. If you guys can come forward to the microphone. Questions for Ricardo or Professor Nauer or anyone?
Hey, how we doing?
Brave soul.
Thank you all very much for being here today. I appreciate it. Ricardo, the question I had was with the initial strike. I didn't catch that. What the initial strike was over?
Over?
Yeah.
What was it about? Like,
Why they were striking?
So we were striking because of cut of funding that was going to happen in the university, where students were, different programs of the students were going to be cut off from the general programming of the university and the system. Couple of students that, if the prices of the credits were increased, weren't going to be able to study next year.
Thank you.
I got one.
Yo, so Ricardo, did you have community support when you guys wanted to re-establish your network? So I know how like, after the hurricane happened and stuff, it probably radio was probably not a lot of people's concerns when they were trying to, get water, food, electricity. So did you guys have community support when you guys were, trying to get your radio station up and running again?
So what happened was that when the community started to get on its feet again, the people were actually not communicated. They didn't have cell phones. They didn't have television, internet, but they did have radio and a radio with batteries, so they could actually listen. They had like she said background
Transistor,
noise, every hours of the day. So radio became really important because it was the way where everyone knew the news about any part of the island, where everyone communicated with their families that were around all of the different municipalities of the island. So it became like a hub for communication, like asking for help, and people did care about it in a way because they find that the response of their needs were actually being heard of.
I have a question. So I think each of you guys have very similar things, right, in different markets. With technological advances exponentially kind of going each day, how do you guys see public radio or radio forecasting or trying to adapt in today's technologically savvy type of economy?
People listen to radio on their phones. So actually, to kind of bring this back to New Bedford, so people in the Guatemalan Mayan community in New Bedford, who are the people who process the scallops that you guys might eat or other fish, right? This is like the workforce in New Bedford, or maybe making some of the clothing that we're wearing. They listen on their smartphones to community radio from Guatemala. So I think that radio, has adapted in that there are people who still, want to listen to those stories. I think that, so people have access to this new technology, but in some cases they use the new technology to listen to the old media because the old media serves needs that other things don't. So if you are from a group who is not represented, not reflected in the mainstream media, you don't speak English in the United States, radio becomes a way that you can find things that speak to you that you can understand. And again, community radio, tends to have a fairly small and direct audience. I mean, they don't have the transmitters or, 500 watts. We're not talking about ones that go a great distance, right? This is, a radius of, especially in the mountains, we might be talking about, 20-kilometer radius or 25-kilometer radius for the direct transmission, but then, through the internet, that allows it to have a broader reach. So I think that it's, I think to just, say what Sally was saying, I don't think this is going away. And people particularly, outside of the United States, I mean, in rural Africa and Zimbabwe and places, where people live outside the reach, outside the scope, CNN isn't talking about them, it's not talking to them. I think that in those areas, rural China, I mean, yeah, people might have cell phones, but the radio still fulfills a role that nothing else does.
Like Brennan said, thank you guys for being here. This is all very interesting. You spoke briefly that radio is helping to preserve indigenous languages that are no longer being spoken in favor of Spanish or English, a more dominant language. And I was just curious if you knew if radio is also helping to preserve some of indigenous ceremonies, such as Native American culture lost the Sundance and everything when it was when our country was colonized. And I was just curious if perhaps radio would also be able to preserve some of the indigenous ceremonies that may be lost because they're largely communicated orally.
Yeah, I know less about community radio or indigenous radio in the United States. I know that there are, particularly in Alaska, there are,
Or
a lot
in
of
Guatemala.
Inuit or other places. Well, it's about preserving knowledge. I don't know that ceremonies directly, but yes, knowledge, foodways, and again, this is partly dependent on if the people on the radio station are interested in that. So people who, work at the radio stations are the kinds of people who are interested in that sort of thing. So food and, growing traditional vegetables and not eating, well, everybody in Guatemala eats tortrix, which is a kind of little like Frito, thing, which is, but it's everywhere. And, to like eating vegetables and going back to what the ancestors, the abuelos and the abuelas ate. So yes, I think that they are kind of, connected, but more about the people who are involved in the radio or the people who are interested in making sure that those things get preserved. And I'm sure that in other places, in Puerto Rico and other places where radio also plays a role in just, transmitting or preserving, maybe not the student radio directly, but other, kinds of community radio play a role in, the festivals and the, other kinds of the music that doesn't go on the mainstream. I mean, there are all kinds of musics, that like now we listen to, bachata is everywhere, but this started out as a music that was very discriminated against in the Dominican Republic when it started in the 1970s and the 1980s, and the only place you could listen to it were like cassettes that you bought in the market and a few radio stations. And now it's like, mainstream, but the history of bachata was it was music that wasn't played on the mainstream radio, and it was just played on these kind of, they had this kind of whole underground life. So I think that, yes, absolutely, in preserving different kinds of cultural tradition and music that is not, the top 40, absolutely.
Thank you.
Time for one more, yeah?
Do you believe radio will always be a backup to the internet, or is it only a matter of time before enough fiber optic cables are made and the internet will die?
I think I know better than to try and predict the demise of radio after all the times that it's been incorrectly predicted. But, there is no question that other forms of consumption are taking hold. I mean, podcast consumption in and of itself has grown hugely in the last few years. There's 20 million people that listen to NPR podcasts, 37 million listen to the radio. More than half of all Americans are now say that they listen to podcasts. And why? Because they're great, because it's a great way to consume audio, and it's on-demand listening that is here to stay. So I think that, but this question of whether the sticks are ever going to go away, I would have said maybe 5 years ago, yeah, they're going to go away and we need to be ready for it. I think we need to be ready to be versatile across platforms, but I think now I feel confident that the sticks are going to stick around. Because it's simple, it's accessible, it's affordable, it reaches
And when your grid goes down because you've had a hurricane,
yeah,
transistor radio still works,
exactly.
right?
In a hurricane, all you need is a transistor.
Or those crank up radios that they're always trying to get you on WGBH.
Exactly.
The crank radio.
I've got one of those. The simple things about radio that have been its mainstay and the reason why it's still so stable and in fact growing are going to be true into the future. So I think it's going to stick around.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you to our panel and to you all for coming. Yes.
Thank you. Un gusto. Gracias. Chairs are like, I really wish they had chairs that didn't have rollers. Just sit in the middle. Take my-